Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the leader of a seminary of what would later be called the Confessing Church during the reign of the Nazi regime in Germany. He was executed by the Nazi regime in 1945 because of his association with a group which attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer understood that throughout most of history, humans had maintained a poor understanding of the world in which they lived. There had always been large gaps in our comprehension of the universe, and traditionally and historically, humans had used myths, legends, and religious beliefs about gods and goddesses to fill in those gaps. The same had been true in Christianity, the only difference being that the explanation was believed to be found in the God of Israel, who became flesh in the person of Jesus the Messiah. However, Bonhoeffer was living in a time in which the human capacity both to uncover and to grasp the intricacies of the universe was growing exponentially. Science had become the new religion, and the perspective of many was that, conceptually, there was no longer any need for the hypothesis of God to fill in the gaps in our knowledge. For example, we didn't need God to explain the cycles of months and years anymore. We had come to understand gravity, the Earth's rotation around the sun, and the physical laws of the universe that guided everything, from the principles of atoms to the movements of stars and galaxies. Beliefs about God that had been born out of human fear and ignorance were no longer necessary to explain the course of our lives, nor were they necessary to explain the environments in which we live and move. And in the wake of these developments, combined with the events which comprised what is now called World War II, Bonhoeffer wrote a letter from prison, in which he said that humanity was proceeding towards a time of no religion at all. Men, as they now are, simply cannot be religious anymore. Now, by religious, Bonhoeffer did not mean to argue that people could no longer be Christians, nor was he saying that it was no longer possible for people to believe in God. Instead, he seems to have meant that humans no longer could simply embrace ignorance and allow both God and the nature of the universe to remain mysteries, inaccessible to human investigation. In other words, we could no longer use the hypothesis of God to explain the gaps in our knowledge simply because there were far fewer gaps than there used to be. And these observations led Bonhoeffer to argue the following, also in a letter from prison. Our coming of age forces us to a true recognition of our situation vis-a-vis God. God is teaching us that we must live as men who can get along very well without Him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. The God who makes us live in this world without using Him as a working hypothesis is the God before whom we are ever standing. Before God and with Him, we live without God. God is weak and powerless in the world, and that is exactly the way, the only way, in which He can be with us and help us. Matthew chapter 8, verse 17 makes it crystal clear that it is not by His omnipotence that Christ helps us, but by His weakness and suffering. That's the end of the quotation. It's not entirely clear what Bonhoeffer meant by these words, but at the very least, it seems that he recognized that faith, which had once been the logical and necessary solution to countless numbers of mysteries in the world, had lost its historical purpose in human culture. To my reading, the question Bonhoeffer has invited us to ask is similar to this. If we can make sense of the world, the universe, and our lives without any reference to God, then where is the place for faith in human life? And it is true that some Christians have solved this dilemma by rejecting the solutions proposed by science and have continued to embrace a more superstitious and mysterious view of the world. However, this was not a rational option for Bonhoeffer. Instead, he seems to have believed that the terror of God that had once been elicited by the ignorance of humanity and was the soil in which traditional religion had grown up, had been supplanted by God in the flesh. In other words, we no longer can root our faith in God in fear and in the terrifying otherness of God. Rather, faith must flow out of the humility of a God who not only became flesh, but created a world that by all appearances operates without need of His constant intervention. With all respect to Bonhoeffer and modernity, there are of course still gaps in human knowledge, and Christianity in the wake of Bonhoeffer's observations has often continued to insert its faith in God into these vacuums of understanding. And for contemporary Christians who've embraced a scientific, materialistic, empirical, and pragmatic understanding of the cosmos, faith speaks to the mysteries of quantum mechanics, to the question of the origin of life on Earth, to the great unknown of death, to the mysterious existence of information and energy, and so on. Religion, as Bonhoeffer conceived of it, has not disappeared. Instead, its territory has been reduced to those areas that science either hasn't yet explained or cannot gain access to. Whereas faith had at one time been necessary to explain nearly everything, now it functions to explain a tiny number of life's remaining mysteries. Even so, Bonhoeffer's struggle to come to grips with the place of faith in the context of the modern world remains challenging. Many contemporary people, and even many who consider themselves Christians, have found that the easiest solution to the problem of faith is to discard it more or less. Such Christians may concede that at one time belief in God solved many dilemmas, but they seem to argue today that it's the belief in God itself that causes more problems than it solves. Surprisingly, perhaps, despite our often romanticized conception of the ease with which pre-scientific people embraced religion and mystery, it would appear that the same challenges of faith were present even in the context of the ancient nation of Israel. The writer of Ecclesiastes refused to allow religion and faith to explain away the realities of the world in which he lived. Consequently, it appears to have been both his attempt to pursue the Hebrew hope of shalom and his desire to remain faithful to the God of the covenant of Mount Sinai that led him not to hope, but to despair. I'm hoping we can bring together in our study of Ecclesiastes today these questions raised by Bonhoeffer in the modern world, and bring them into the context of a similar discussion that was being had in ancient times. If you have access to a Bible, I invite you to turn with me to the book of Ecclesiastes in the First Testament. Now, to begin, there's been quite a bit of debate surrounding both the author of Ecclesiastes and the timing of its writing. The principal speaker only identifies himself as Kohelet, which is a difficult word in Hebrew to translate. It seems to be either a title or an office that has something to do with an assembly of people, but it's hard to say much more. This individual identified himself in the text as a son of David, king over Israel in Jerusalem, who was wiser than all who had ruled before him. Many have therefore associated the writing with King Solomon. However, there are a number of reasons to suspect that the book was written long after Solomon's time. Furthermore, there are some passages in the book that would be hard to imagine Solomon or any ruling king saying. In my opinion, Ecclesiastes was probably written sometime after the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah and the exile of the Israelite leaders to Babylon. For me, Kohelet is a literary composite of all the kings in the line of David that ruled from Jerusalem. In other words, I read the Kohelet passages of Ecclesiastes as the reflections of a non-ruling descendant of David, reflecting on the entire history of the reign of his family over Israel. In accord with Tremper Longman III, I believe that what we have essentially is a warning given from a teacher to a student regarding the lessons of Israelite history, as we can see in both the introduction in chapter 1 verses 1 through 11, and in the conclusion to the book in chapter 12 verses 8 through 14. At the heart of the book, in my opinion, is the search of Israel as depicted through the reigns of the Davidic kings, for shalom. That is, for completeness, for peace, for security, for permanence, ultimately for contentment. However, for Kohelet, this search has proven to be frustratingly elusive. The tension that's created between the promises that God has made in his covenants with humanity and the actual experiences of Israelite history has created the dilemma which consumes much of the book of Ecclesiastes. Again, Longman, in his commentary on Ecclesiastes, explains that wisdom, for much of the First Testament, is the practical ability to recognize the correct times and ways in which to apply the teachings of Torah in everyday life. However, for Kohelet, the wisdom project to produce people faithful to Torah had proven to be a dismal failure. More particularly, due to the nature of reality, the activities of God, and the limitations of humans, Faithfulness had proven to be an impossible ideal, despite the laudable intentions of the wisdom tradition in Israel. So that's a broad overview of what I see happening in the text of Ecclesiastes overall. Our conversation today will focus on chapter 3, verses 1 through 22. However, I want to begin with a quotation from the first verses of chapter 1, and I'll be reading from Robert Alter's translation. It's not a very common one, so in the case that you don't have access to his book, I'd encourage you simply to listen to this first reading. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Merest breath, said Kohelet, merest breath. All is mere breath. What gain is there for man in all his toil that he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth endures forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and to its place it glides, there it rises. It goes to the south and swings round to the north, round and round goes the wind, and on its round the wind returns. All the rivers go to the sea, and the sea is not full. To the place that the rivers go, there they return to go. All things are weary. A man cannot speak. The eye is not sated with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which was is what will be, and that which was done is that which will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. There is a thing of which one would say, see this, it's new. It already has been in the eons that were before us. There is no remembrance of the first things, nor of the last things that will be. They will have no remembrance with those who will be in the latter time. Ecclesiastes begins with the claim that all is merest breath. Many translations of this phrase have been offered in English. The New King James Version, New American Standard Bible, and New Revised Standard Version translate it vanity of vanities. The New International Version and the New Living Translation translate it meaningless. The New English Bible translates it emptiness. The Message translates it smoke. The original Hebrew phrase beneath all of these translations is havel havalim. The word havel in Hebrew appears to have originated with the idea of an exhaled breath, probably associated with the visible vapor that's breathed out on a cold day and dissipates quickly. I prefer the translation merest breath, but however you translate the phrase, for the writer of Ecclesiastes, all is havel havalim. In the verses within chapter 3 that we're going to focus on today, the Kohelet has identified 4 obstacles that have consistently frustrated human attempts to walk in faithfulness. For Kohelet, these 4 obstacles have always prevented and will always prevent humans from experiencing true shalom, simplistically understood as peace. Don't misunderstand me, though. These are not the only 4 obstacles to faithfulness that Kohelet identifies in Ecclesiastes. However, they are the 4 in the passage I've chosen to discuss today, and they should serve as representative examples of the kinds of things that make it impossible for us to find true shalom in this world. The first obstacle to faithfulness that Kohelet identifies in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is the limitation of human perspective. Follow along with me as I read Ecclesiastes 3, beginning in verse 1. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to throw away, a time to tear, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the busyness that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. Essentially, Kohelet begins this portion of his reflection with a summary of the teachings of Torah. All of the behaviors in this initial list are things that have been commanded by Torah in different circumstances. The key to wisdom for the wisdom tradition of Israel and for Kohelet is the proper identification of the time in which each of these behaviors is to be considered appropriate. For example, when King Saul went to war against the Amalekites in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul's activity has been seen as appropriate because that was the time for war. However, when King Josiah many generations later went to war against the Egyptians in 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verses 20 through 27, the chronicler has told us that God allowed him to be killed because then was not a time for war. By taking Torah and applying it to the history of the kings of Israel and Judah, we can find examples of most, if not all, of the behaviors in the list Kohelet has given us, some proving to be performed in the right time, and others in the wrong time. For Kohelet, this is the miserable business that God has given to all people, that is, the job of discerning the right occasion for the appropriate behavior. Kohelet even says that God has given us a sense of time, so ostensibly we could learn from the past and prepare for the future. However, and here's the frustration, we have no way of discerning what God is doing. God may have ordained a suitable time for every activity, but humanity has proven incapable of discerning it consistently. Because of this reality, we can never truly discover the appropriate time. Our perspective is simply too limited. How then can we remain faithful? Kohelet continues to conclude that all we can be certain of is our experience of the present, and we can only hope that our experience of the present is pleasant. That's the best we can hope for, but true faithfulness, true wisdom, that's out of our grasp. I suspect here that Kohelet is simply extending a teaching we find in Deuteronomy chapter 20 verses 1 through 9. In Deuteronomy, the Israelites were told that even in a time of war, before they fought, they should go home and dedicate a new house, or enjoy the first fruits of a new vineyard, or indulge in the bliss of being newly married, or even go home to find encouragement, because it was likely that they would die in battle and never get to indulge in any of these things. In Deuteronomy, it is always a time to enjoy God's blessings, even if only momentarily, and I believe that's Kohelet's only recourse from Torah given the dilemma he's identified. Even so, the limitations of the human perspective and the secretive nature of God and his activities, for Kohelet, makes it impossible for humans to determine the right times for each behavior under the sun consistently. Therefore, wisdom, true wisdom, will always be out of our grasp. Therefore, we can never know truly what it means to walk in faithfulness in any given situation. In the end, we're always guessing. I wonder if Kohelet's conclusions resonate with you. Do you agree with him? Could you say with him, everything is merest breath, Havel Havalim? The first obstacle to faithfulness that Kohelet identifies is the limitation of human perspective. The second is the impermanence of human endeavors. Let's continue in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 now in verse 14. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this, so that all should stand in awe before him. That which is, already has been. That which is to be, already is, and God seeks out what has gone by. These two verses have proven to be extremely difficult, both to translate and to understand, and there are nuances in some of the phrases in these verses that are worth investigating individually. For instance, according to Kohelet, God intends this reality to be as it is, so that all should fear him. It's hard to know precisely what Kohelet means by this observation. Additionally, the concluding phrase, and God seeks out what has gone by, is similarly perplexing. However, for our purposes today, I'm more interested in the larger argument that Kohelet is making, and thankfully that's a bit simpler to discern. Essentially, Kohelet is arguing in these verses that only God can perform works that stand the test of time. Everything else is a mere repetition, a chasing after Havel Havalim, the merest breath. Kohelet, as he perused the history of Judah's kings, recognizes that nothing we do is permanent. Faithful kings were followed by faithless kings, who were followed by faithful kings, And it went on, and none of them perfectly embraced wisdom or evidenced complete faithfulness to Torah. Only the works of God have proven to be permanent, and yet God remains outside of our ability to perceive his work. If nothing stands, and no one remembers what's gone before, as Kohelet was said to teach in chapter 1, and therefore we have no permanent examples of wisdom and faithfulness from which to draw, then how can we walk in faithfulness? Do you agree with Kohelet? Can you say with him, everything is merest breath, havel havalim, a chasing after the wind? The first obstacle to faithfulness that Kohelet identifies is the limitation of human perspective. The second is the impermanence of human endeavor. The third is the impurity of human justice and righteousness. Follow along with me as I continue reading in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, now in verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. Kohelet had discovered that both justice and righteousness had been polluted with wickedness. There's nowhere one can go to see unpolluted justice and righteousness. Kohelet's commitment to Torah instructed him that God is the only being qualified to judge, but that's less of a solution and more of a dilemma for Kohelet. He has already observed that God's ways are unknowable for humans. So if God is the only one who can judge rightly, then we're left in a situation in which we cannot know true justice or true righteousness. As humans, we're forced to live in a world that has compromised itself in incalculable ways. Kohelet recognized this throughout the history of Israel, and perhaps in his own context as well. If only God can judge in justice and righteousness, and God's activity is outside of our ability to know and experience, then how can we walk in faithfulness? If everything that we try and everything to which we look will prove to have been polluted, then how can we be faithful? Can you say with Kohelet, everything is havel havalim, merest breath? The first obstacle to faithfulness that Kohelet identifies is the limitation of human perspective. The second is the impermanence of human endeavor. The third is the impurity of human justice and righteousness. The fourth is the temporariness of human life. Follow with me as I continue to read from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, now in verse 18. I said in my heart with regard to human beings that God is testing them to show that they are but animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and humans have no advantage over the animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knows whether the human spirit goes upward, and the spirit of animals goes downward to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. Who can bring them to see what will be after them? I believe it's fair to summarize this entire segment of Kohelet's argument with the following question. What is the point of faithfulness anyway? Whether one is wise or foolish, righteous or wicked, irrespective of whether the thing in question is an animal or a human, everything seems to meet the same end. Everything dies, and we cannot know what happens after death for certain. So for Kohelet, practically speaking, all we can do is do our best and enjoy what we can. And apparently God has placed us in this situation to reveal to us that though we are made in the image of God, we are not gods. The final obstacle to faithfulness is death, presumably because the reality of death calls into question the point of faithfulness. If all roads lead to the same end, then what does it matter which road one takes? Though Kohelet is sure that God will make the right judgment regarding people, it's hard for him to see why that judgment matters in the end, if all do, in fact, die. Kohelet, as may be apparent, does not appear to have embraced the hope of an afterlife, as was true of a number of the writers of the First Testament. And that has led some Christians to believe that the Christian belief in resurrection from the dead essentially solves Kohelet's dilemma. After all, if there is resurrection of the dead, and God will judge everyone eventually, then there is a point to living faithfully, even if we don't see it on this side of eternity. However, I'm not sure even resurrection would satisfy Kohelet, or much of the First Testament. Isn't this the very concern of Jonah, in the book of Jonah, for instance? Israel had failed to live faithfully, but they had tried. The Assyrians, on the other hand, had not even attempted to live faithfully. Jonah knew that according to the law, the Assyrians deserved death, but he refused to go to them as God commanded him because he was afraid that God would forgive them. He did not trust God to be just or to reward righteousness. Jonah might have said with Kohelet, if the road of wickedness that the Assyrians have walked leads to forgiveness, just like the road of righteousness that Israel tried to walk, then what is the point of faithfulness? Fundamentally, Kohelet, and certainly Jonah, desired to see the distinction that God would make between the righteous and the wicked in this life, in order to give this life meaning. If that judgment is only reserved for the next life, then again, what is the point of faithfulness now? I'm not sure the cross settles this issue. In fact, it may make it more poignant. After all, if we're saved by grace through faith and not by works, as Paul has insisted in the book of Ephesians, then what now is the point of faithfulness? Again, perhaps you would say with Kohelet, all is Havel Havalim, merest breath. The first obstacle to faithfulness that Kohelet identifies is the limitation of human perspective. The second is the impermanence of human endeavor. The third is the impurity of human justice and righteousness. And the fourth is the temporariness of human life. This is a challenging sermon. If we can't be faithful because of our limited perspective, because of the impermanence of our works, because of the impurity of our justice and righteousness, and because of the temporariness of our lives, then what is the point of trying to walk faithfully after God? Well, it's at this point that I think Jesus' death and resurrection needs to be situated in order for us to understand what it means for the gospel of Jesus to be good news for us, news that Kohelet might even have embraced as good. The only New Testament allusion to the book of Ecclesiastes appears to be found in chapter 8 of Paul's epistle to the churches in Rome. And it does not appear that St. Paul disagreed with Ecclesiastes' basic understanding of life. The word that the New Revised Standard Version translates futility in Romans chapter 8 verse 20 is the same word we find in the Greek translation of Ecclesiastes for the phrase Havel Havalim, merest breath. In Romans chapter 8 verses 18 to 25 we read these words. This is St. Paul the Apostle. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility. That's Havel Havalim, merest breath. Not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay, and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Can you hear St. Paul addressing the issues raised in Ecclesiastes in that passage? St. Paul embraced the idea that all of creation has been subjected to this emptiness, to this futility, to this vanity, this wispiness, however we might translate Havel Havalim. But for Paul, God did not do this only so that we might fear him, which was the conclusion of the writer of Ecclesiastes, but also in hope that all would be set free. For Paul, it is the very despair and hopelessness of this world that creates a longing in us for something else, for something more. The very longing that we've seen Kohelet desperately display. Resurrection of the dead alone would be insufficient if we remained largely as we were, and the world remained largely as it is. It was for this reason that God did not want Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of life after they had disobeyed in the garden. Eternal life in this situation would be insufferable. Not even Kohelet hoped for that. We and creation need to be set free from this mere breathiness, from this havel havelim, from this futility. We need true shalom, and that will require true liberation. Mark chapter 15 tells us that when Jesus died, he gave a loud cry and breathed his last. In the moment of death, Mark wants us to know that the life breath that God breathed into humanity in the Garden of Eden, Jesus exhaled out at the moment of his death. Would it prove, as Kohelet feared, to be havel havelim? Or would the breath of God persist? As all things that have lived on earth, Jesus died, and the hope of humanity accompanied him to the grave. However, on the morning of the third day, the day that we celebrate on Resurrection Sunday, on Easter Sunday, Jesus rose from the dead. But he did not rise as he had been, nor did he set up a kingdom here on the earth. He rose with a new body, liberated from the corruption and the havel havelim of this world. And the Gospels tell us that he went to prepare a place for us. The book of Revelation calls that place a new heaven and a new earth, and Paul calls it the hope of glory in his epistles. The good news, when understood in this context, is that the frustration, the futility, the emptiness, the repetitiveness that is this world has been put to death in Jesus. His resurrection anticipates not only human resurrection, but the exodus of all things out of slavery to havel havelim, to emptiness. This reality certainly would have given hope to Kohelet. But how does it address his fundamental question? Namely, what is the point of faithfulness? Can we be faithful now? Do we have to be faithful now? I think for Paul and the rest of the New Testament, we can be faithful now, and we must be faithful now for two primary reasons. First, what it means to be faithful has been redefined in Jesus. And second, the transformation of humanity has already begun in the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on the people of God. Kohelet and the other writers of the First Testament had no true and consistent examples of faithfulness through which they might interpret God's perspective on the matter. Even Moses himself failed God on numerous occasions, one of which prevented him from being allowed to enter the Promised Land. Kohelet's constant complaint is that humanity is too limited in perspective, too impermanent in its works, too impure in its justice and righteousness, and too finite in its existence to be faithful. However, in Jesus, humanity has received an example that, in being God, is not limited in his perspective. In being God, can perform works that stand forever. In being God, is qualified to judge between justice and wickedness and righteousness and wickedness, and in being raised from the dead will never die again. We have been set free from a written law that stands in condemnation over us, and we've been put in submission to a person whose very life, teachings, and behavior become for us the way of true faithfulness. We can and must walk faithfully now because in Jesus, faithfulness can finally be comprehended and understood. Even more, Jesus was enabled to walk in faithfulness, at least in part because God had breathed his own Holy Spirit into him at his baptism. If we follow Jesus, the Gospels seem to indicate that God will breathe the same Spirit into us. In fact, that is what St. Paul the Apostle had argued in Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 17, just before the passage that we read together. It would appear that Kohelet was right about everything being havel havelim, and that is precisely why the death and resurrection of Jesus is good news for all humanity. Our hope is not that we will simply live forever, but rather that we will be set free from this world of havel havelim, of emptiness, of vanity, of futility. Our joy and responsibility while we await that day is not to remain faithful to a legal document or to an ambiguously worded covenant. Instead, we are to walk as Jesus walked, to live as Jesus lived, and when we face death and suffering, to suffer and to die in faithfulness as Jesus suffered and died. And all this is possible because something from the new liberated world has already been given to us now, the very Holy Spirit of God. So how does all this connect with the issues with which we began? How might we respond to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the dilemma that scientific discovery has posed to Christian faith? I think in the end, science has not filled in as many gaps as it believes it has. The gaps in understanding it has filled in are in the end Havel Havalim. That is, they are temporary realities. There's nothing of the truth of reality discovered there, but only the truth of corrupted, temporary, and dying reality. A thoroughgoing understanding of the way this universe was intended to work is lost to us. And a thoroughgoing understanding of the way this universe works right now will not liberate humanity. It will only serve to imprison us further. Now, such knowledge is not bad in and of itself. It's probably necessary for life in this place. But it will not provide meaning to this life. All that is now is destined for destruction, and therefore full and complete understanding of it is only Havel Havalim. Faith is directed at the way the world should be, might have been, not the way the world is. We can learn a great deal from an engineless car, but we'll never discover exactly how the car worked if the one we study has no engine. Kohelet realized centuries ago something that eludes even many Christians who are scientists today. There is something missing from the universe, and without that missing thing, we will never truly understand it or our place in it. For people of faith, we can glimpse that missing element in Christ. We may be able to live today without using God as a hypothesis, but the life that we live in that way is not life. In the words of Kohelet, it is only Havel Havalim, a chasing after the wind.